Good evening, everyone. I have put the meeting live on YouTube and I've made Sir co-host in case he wishes to share his screen. We may begin now.
Shivam, can we start now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, sure. When you have a dream, you have got to grab it and never let go. Good evening to one and all. I'm Soumya Mishra, a student of BA English at B.N.N.College, your host for today's workshop. I extend a warm welcome to all at the 15th National Level E-Workshop on UGC NET JRF in English on the occasion of the centenary celebration of the birth anniversary of Shri Padma Shri Anna Sahib Jadhav. I would like to extend a special thanks to our respected principal of B.N.N. College, Dr. Ashok Wagh, Dr. Sudhir Nikam, Head of English Department and Chairman of Board of Studies in English University of Mumbai, Dr. Sashikant Malunkar, IQAC Coordinator, Professor Bhimrao Paikrao and Professor Rajni Rajbhau Wagmare for their immense support and contribution to make this event successful. This workshop aims to invite and accomplish individuals across to motivate, guide, and impart valuable knowledge to UGC NET aspirants. The motive is also to introduce the best practices to crack the exam. It's a great opportunity for me to introduce our honorable chief guest and keynote speaker, Dr. T.K. Rajendran, to start the day 12th workshop. Sir is presently working as an assistant professor at the Research Department of English, University College, Tiruvananthapuram. His research areas include literary theory and cultural studies. Today, Dr. T.K. Rajendran will be enlightening us on the topic of cultural studies. Dr. Rajendran, sir, we are indeed very grateful for your valuable presence with us. We are looking forward to observing the immense knowledge that you will be inculcating this evening. I sincerely request Dr. Rajendran to speak and enumerate with his spellbinding words as we commence with the workshop. I, Ms. Soumya Mishra, welcome you once again, sir, on the behalf of B.N.N. College. Over to you, sir. Sir, can you please unmute yourself?
Okay, am I audible now?
Yes, sure. You can start now.
Okay, thank you, Soumya, for your good words. I'm very happy to meet you all. First of all, I extend my gratitude to all the organizers of this national level seminar for the UGC NET aspirants. And I'm also, really proud of being part of this event. And a special thanks to my friend Srikant. Okay, so this is a webinar meant for the NET aspirants. And again, but beyond that, I hope that it will be very useful to all your future academic career. I mean, the entire seminar. So that will be, I am sure that it will be very enlightening to you, and you will be definitely benefited by the talks given in the national seminar. Okay. So more than for a preparation of UGC NET, so this should be considered as an academic event. And you should have a genuine academic interest in learning, the different areas covered in the NET syllabus, because that is a very effective way to study English literature. And so my topic is cultural studies. Just before starting our discussion, let me know how much time I can take for this.
Approximately 1 hour, sir.
1 hour.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Okay. So because, this is a vast area, and this is, an important area in the syllabus, UGC NET syllabus. So when you study, just as introductory, when you study or when you prepare for the UGC NET examination or any such examination, so you must be thorough with the major concepts, the ideas in all those areas. So that means just by harping some, one-word objective type question answers will not do anything good to the students, because the examination, UGC NET examination is designed in such a way that it will test your comprehensive, your in a total comprehension of the important concepts, ideas, and the like. So that is what they are trying to test in the examination. And then okay, literary studies in the 20th century, witnessed several terms. There are several terms in literary studies in the 20th century. And the first term was the linguistic term, which marked the transition from literary criticism to literary theory. So that is what is called the linguistic term, especially after the introduction of Saussurean linguistics. There was a turn in literary and cultural studies, and that was called the linguistic term. And all those literary theories, the so-called high voltage literary theories, like structuralism, post-structuralism, postmodernism, Lacanian psychoanalysis, Levi-Strauss structural anthropology, and all those theories were the products of the linguistic term. And so that means Saussurean linguistics became the framework or tool for the analysis of literature, culture, and ethnographic details. And this is what is called the linguistic term, which finally, culminated in the development of literary theory. And you might have discussed literary theory in the previous sessions. But in the second half of the 20th century, especially in 1960s, there was another term, or after 60s or 70s, or in 70s, there was another, important term in literary studies, and that term was called cultural term. Cultural term. And cultural term, culminated in the development of what we now call cultural studies. And so this is the beginning of cultural studies. So now, so today let us trace the development of cultural studies from its very beginning to the present day. So that is what we are trying to do, just an introduction to the basics of cultural studies. And we have to first prepare the ground for the study of cultural studies. So for that, I would like to, draw your attention to the important socio-political, cultural background of the 20th century, the last part of the 19th century and the 20th century, and in the 21st century. So then only we shall get a true significance of cultural studies. And this should be your strategy in the preparation of literature also. So when you study a particular paper in the UGC NET syllabus, first you must develop an understanding of the socio-political, cultural background of the age. And then you have to identify the important writers of the age. And next, you have to narrow down your focus. That is, you have to identify the important works of each important writer. And then you have to study the characters of the important works of each author. Thus, when you narrow down your focus like this, you can answer all the questions in the examination. So that will be the strategy. So in the same way, so when you study cultural studies, you must be familiar with the socio-political background of the age. And then, first let me, share a PPT with you now. So it is said that the host disabled participant screen sharing, and so I can't actually share my PPT. Yeah. Now, what shall I do now? Shall I proceed without PPT?
Yes, sir.
Sir, could you try once again?
Oh, yeah, sure. Yes, now it's okay.
Yes, sir, it's visible.
Okay. Is it visible now?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Oh,
It is visible now.
Okay, right. If you don't mind, could you please make me the co-host so that I think there is some problem with my webcam. And pardon?
You're already a co-host, sir.
Oh, okay. And again, my webcam is something I think it's not clear that much. But I have installed another webcam, and that doesn't work here.
But we can see you.
Okay. No problem. Then. Okay. Yes. No, there is a theory in in sociology called the wave theory. And according to the wave theory, there are three important waves in the development of human culture. The first wave was the agrarian wave, where people depended on agriculture as their means of production. And at that time, life was rather settled and collective. But later, this agrarian wave was replaced by the industrial wave after industrialization, and industries became the main means of production. And during this age, life was rather migratory and individual-centered, not collective, but individual-centered. And the third wave is the wave in which we live now, that is the information wave, where life is global. So these are the three important waves in the history of human culture. And then our culture studies has its beginning in the industrial wave, and industrial society developed after industrialization, after the industrial revolution. And industrial revolution was not merely a change in the mode of production. It was a great event with multi-dimensional consequences, and the whole European society was reconfigured, completely reconfigured after industrialization. And there were, two classes developed: the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. The bourgeoisie, the capitalists, and the proletariat, the laborers. And life became individualistic during those days. And there was also what is called the domestication of technology, because up to the beginning of the 20th century, technology was not domesticated. It was an elite affair up to the beginning of the 20th century. And after the 20th century, after the first decade of the 20th century, there was the domestication of technology, because technology began to affect daily life. Motor cars were marketed, and then motor cars became popular. Then electronic gadgets like the radio, the telegraph or telephone, and later television, and all those things began to affect daily life. And this is what is called the domestication of technology. And again, another point was that a negative impact of industrialization was the large-scale unemployment at the beginning of the 20th century. Unemployment was there. And then unemployment was one of the major problems faced by Britain at the beginning of the 20th century. And then at that time, England was saved from unemployment by an American industrialist. And he was Henry Ford, an American industrialist, Henry Ford. So what is the significance of Ford in contemporary culture studies? Henry Ford. Who was Henry Ford? He was the car manufacturer, automobile manufacturer, Ford car. And he marketed Ford car in Europe. And what is special about this industrialist shows that for the first time in history, he introduced a particular technique of production, and that is what's called assembly line production. Assembly line production. So what is assembly line production? So it's a particular method of production introduced by Henry Ford. And at the factories, there will be a huge conveyor belt. And the products, so here in this case, the cars are placed on the conveyor belts, and the conveyor belt is moving at a particular slow speed, and the laborers would be stationed at a particular points, and they have to perform the work assigned to them within that particular short period of time. That means before that thing leaves the place. And a parody of this kind of production was given in Charlie Chaplin's film Modern Times. And now they have very sophisticated technology. That means assembly line technology, as we can see in contemporary production of motor vehicles. I mean, especially cars. I shall show you a video of assembly line. So it's called assembly line because the products are placed in the conveyor belts, just like children standing in a school assembly. That's why it's called assembly line technology, assembly line production. Okay, can you see the video?
Yes, sir.
I hope you have watched this video. So this is how the production is now done. I know not only in automobile industry, in almost all the industries, they practiced this kind of assembly line technology. And so this is what we now call Fordism. So that's a term in culture studies, Fordism. So what is Fordism? Fordism is assembly line technology. And again, how this helped the people or helped the country to solve the problem of unemployment. So that is a very important question. It's a misconception that when machines are introduced, that will reduce employability. That's a misconception. And when computers were first introduced in our country, there were violent agitations. What was the cause? What was the reason? Because several political parties of the time claimed that the introduction of machinery would reduce employability, and the result would be unemployment. But later, time proved that it was wrong. Because, now the IT industry is actually providing the largest number of providing people with the largest number of jobs. So that's it. And so, because in computerization, skill was replaced by technology. So that is the cultural impact of Fordism. Skill was replaced by technology. Because if you observe the unemployed population of a country, you can see that they are de-skilled people. The unemployed people of a country are de-skilled people or people without any skill. The skilled people would somehow find a position in somewhere, industry or in any job sector. But after Fordism, skill was not at all a prerequisite for jobs, because all those works that needed skill would be done by machines. This is the cultural impact of Fordism. And so Ford saved the country from unemployment. And again, another thing that we have to bear in mind is culture industry. And this is a term introduced by the Frankfurt School Marxist philosophers, Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer. And they introduced this term, culture industry, because according to them, culture now behaves like an industry. So the relationship culture and industry is actually a relationship between, it's a kind of mutual interaction, it's a kind of complementary interaction. So that means culture shapes industry, and again, industry too shapes culture. So you might have discussed some disturbance. Okay. And you might have discussed this in detail in Marxist literary criticism. Okay. Now, so you have to be aware of all these developments before we start our discussion on culture studies. This is the socio-political background against which we can study culture studies. And now, see, cultural studies as a discipline is a study of culture. That is very obvious. It is a study of culture. But this study of culture, the history of this study of culture can be traced back to Matthew Arnold in the 19th century, the poet critic Matthew Arnold. And Arnold it was perhaps Matthew Arnold who first started a discussion on culture, and he published a book called Culture and Anarchy, which in 1868, Culture and Anarchy in 1868. And again, you might be familiar with the circumstances under which he had composed this book, Culture and Anarchy. It was it was actually occasioned by what is called the Hyde Park riot in British history, which took place in 1866. And in 1866, a large number of laborers assembled at a park called Hyde Park in London. And their aim was to protest against the new reforms in the country. And the government, the British government, declared it as an unlawful assembly. But they, were not ready to disperse. So a police action followed. And this was what is called the Hyde Park riot. And when he thought about this Hyde Park riot, Arnold said that there is something wrong with the British society. The problem with the British society of the time was the conflict that existed among three important groups of the British society. They were the barbarians, the Philistines, and the populace. The barbarians, the Philistines, and the populace. The barbarians here refers to the aristocrats. They were the landowners and they were the producers of the society. And then the populace are the, laborers, the landless people of the country. And again, between them, between the barbarians and the populace, there existed a group of middlemen called the Philistines. They are the, they are merchants, the middle class people, the bourgeoisie, and the like. So these are the three groups that existed in the British society. And Arnold said that the problem with the British society was that the British culture was that there was a kind of conflict among the interests of these three classes. As landowners and producers of the society, the barbarians' interest was to sell their products at as high a price as possible. That was their interest. But as landless poor people of the country, the populace wanted to buy the products at as low a cost as possible. And again, the Philistines wanted to buy the products from the barbarians at as low a cost as possible and sell the same products to the populace at as high a price as possible. And so that means these are the three groups of people with the three different interests. And again, according to Matthew Arnold, in this conflict, those people are, the best people are those who could transcend their class positions. They are the best. Those people who could think beyond their class interests were the best people in the society. And thus, finally, he defined culture as the best that is known and taught in the world. This is Arnold's version of culture. Culture as the best that is known and taught in the world. And now, again, in the 20th century, Matthew Arnold's work was carried forward by another major literary critic of the time, that was Dr. F.R. Lewis. Dr. F.R. Lewis and his wife Q.D. Lewis, and together they were called the Lewis, and their followers were called the Lewisites. And they introduced the concept of the great tradition. It was a book written by Dr. F.R. Lewis, The Great Tradition. And F.R. Lewis said that English literature had a great tradition ranging from Shakespeare to Jane Austen. And the works of English literature, the works of those writers, that means the writers ranging between Shakespeare and Jane Austen, should be compulsorily taught at the schools and colleges of English. Then only those children could get an understanding of the rich tradition of English literature. And what was the occasion for this kind of a theorizing? I told you in the beginning that after the introduction of Fordism, unemployment was not there. And majority of the people got employment. British people got employment after the introduction of Fordist production technology, because it was accepted by all the other industries. And production increased. So export increased. So money began to flow to England, and again more and more industries were introduced. And by the end of the first half of the 20th century, England became a fully employed country. So the standard of living improved. And again, because of the introduction of technology, work became very easy for the people. And again, the British government introduced universal and compulsory education at the beginning of the 20th century. So children below a particular age should be compulsorily sent to schools. And so universal education was introduced. And after the introduction of compulsory education, the rate of literacy increased. And again, at that time, there were no mobile phones, internet connections, and there was not even television at that time. And there was no way to pass the time. And for time pass, there was no means other than reading. So people during those days resorted to reading because they could read now, and they again spent their leisure time in reading because there was no other pastime. And so at that time, again, the newly literate class, their aesthetic sensibility was not so refined as the university educated people of that time. So they found it difficult to digest classical English literary texts. I mean, like the texts of Shakespeare, the plays of Shakespeare, the poems of Spenser, or the poems of Coleridge or Shelley. And because their aesthetic taste was not so refined, they were just able to read and write. And so to cater to their needs, a new form of literature developed. And that was what is called a popular literature. Popular literature. Literary works containing a lot of, what we now call in India called masala things. A lot of, exciting episodes, melodramatic episodes containing murder, theft, elopement, even pornographic details. So those were actually called popular literature. And then people, those days people spent their time in reading such popular literature. And again, the thing was that they could not be considered as standard English literature, because a reading of such, literary texts, I mean, such sorts of things would make people perverts. So that's the thing. And again, those books were printed on cheap pulp, and that was why they were also called a pulp fiction. Pulp fiction. And then pulp fiction was introduced. And it is in this context that we have to understand the significance of the Great Tradition. So it is in this context that Dr. F.R. Lewis insisted on having a great tradition of English literature, because otherwise the coming generation would mistake these silly texts as a standard English literature. And that was why he insisted on introducing English literature from Shakespeare to Jane Austen in the school and college curricula. And so this is F.R. Lewis' concept of culture, that is culture as the great tradition that existed in the past. And then again, finally, cultural studies started, I mean, cultural studies as we use the term today, it started with another great writer, Richard Hogarth. Richard Hogarth, who lived from 1918 to 2014. Richard Hogarth. And Hogarth in 1964 started the Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies. The Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies, or CCCS, at Birmingham University. Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies. Now it is closed, but this was the starting point, the inauguration of cultural studies. That is the foundation of this book, this institution, the CCCS, Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies at Birmingham University, and this was also called the Birmingham School. And the most important contribution of Hogarth was the book, The Uses of Literacy. The Uses of Literacy. So this is a very important text in cultural studies, The Uses of Literacy. So this book is divided into two parts. And in the first part, he examines with a kind of nostalgia an old order of working class life. So because before the development of popular literature, the working class people had their own, particular forms of art, like folk songs, folk arts, folk plays, and they had such a wonderful culture. But all those cultural forms were replaced by the silly texts of popular literature. And that was definitely a negative impact. And so, Hogarth himself belonged to a working class family. He himself belonged to a working class family. And so he, at that time, recalled with dismay, disappointment, the loss of that old order of working class life. And now in the second part, he criticized such popular literature and spicy magazines. And then another major influence on cultural studies was E.P. Thompson. E.P. Thompson. And his most important contribution was the book, The Making of the English Working Class. The Making of the English Working Class. So here he again discussed how the English working class, developed over the ages. So now we have a long, series of, theoreticians or literary figures. That is Matthew Arnold, F.R. Lewis, Hogarth, E.P. Thompson. And if we analyze the concepts of culture put forward by all these people, all these writers, we can see that their concept of culture is not all-inclusive. It is not all-inclusive. It is elitist in nature. So their concept of culture is somewhat elitist. What is meant by elitist? Elitist means, so that means their concept of culture is reserved for a particular section of people. They were not ready to consider culture as an all-inclusive term. Instead, they reserved the term culture for a particular section of the society. To Matthew Arnold, culture is the best that is known and thought in the world. And F.R. Lewis, it is great tradition. And again, E.P. Thompson and Hogarth were not ready to consider popular literature as part of culture. So that means in all these writings, in all these critics, we can see that their concept of culture is not all-inclusive. In fact, their concept of culture is elitist. And now, but things changed completely with the arrival of another great figure in culture studies, and it was Raymond Williams. Raymond Williams. the new left thinker from Britain, Raymond Williams, who lived from 1921 to 1988, Raymond Williams. And Williams wrote a very brilliant book, Culture and Society. And again, what is special about Raymond Williams is that for the first time in cultural studies, Williams said that culture is ordinary. Culture is ordinary. You got it? And culture is a whole way of life according to Williams. It is not, reserved to a particular section of the society, but it is all inclusive. It is ordinary. It is that which the people make common. That is culture. It is a whole way of life. And we cannot say that culture, this is culture and the other is culturelessness. So we can't draw such distinctions. All these things are part of what we should call culture. And culture is ordinary. So this is how he is different from his predecessors. In the case of his predecessors, culture was not an all-inclusive concept. It was reserved for a special group of people in the society. But here, Raymond Williams said that culture is ordinary. It is a whole way of life. And then he introduced three forms of culture. He said that there are three forms of culture. Which are the three forms of culture? In every society, there exist three forms of culture. The dominant culture, you should not, forget these forms of culture. Dominant culture, residual culture, and emergent culture. So these are the three forms of culture introduced by Raymond Williams. Dominant, residual, and emergent. And what is the dominant culture? So in every society, there is a mainstream culture. That means the ideas commonly shared by the people. And that is the mainstream culture of the society. So that means we, in spite of all our individual differences, we as Indians have something in common. Our attitudes, our thought process. So they are actually conditioned by some dominant, ideology or dominant culture of our times. And this is what is called the dominant culture. And in every society, we can see that kind of a dominant culture. And then there is residual culture, what he called residual culture. So what is a residual culture? Residues. Residues are leftovers. Culture is always dynamic, it's subjected to change. And again, today's dominant culture may become tomorrow's residual culture. And in the same way, in every culture, there are some residues, leftovers of the dominant culture of the past, which means those cultural forms were the dominant culture in the past, but now they are no longer dominant, but they exist in the contemporary dominant culture as residues, as leftovers. And this is what is called a residual culture. So I shall just show you an example of residual culture. I shall show you a video. So, can you watch this video? Okay, have you watched this video?
Yes, sir.
Okay, any idea about what it is? Somebody please respond. I consider this as a discussion.
No, sir, we don't know about it.
Okay. Have you watched the beginning of this video? Like, okay. So this is the ceremonial festival procession of Lord Sri Padmanabha Swami Temple at Sri Padmanabha Swami Temple, one of the richest temples of the world. So it is here in Trivandrum. And this is the ceremonial festival procession of Lord Padmanabha. And again, the thing is that you can see in the beginning that the procession was escorted by the Kerala police. And there was a police band set at the front, and also horse-mounted policemen were there. And when the deity was taken out of the temple, the Kerala police would give a gun salute to the deity. Why? What may be the reason? Because this was something related to Kerala history. In 1750, the ruler of Travancore at that time, King Martandavarma Maharaja, dedicated the kingdom to Lord Padmanabha. And after that, Lord Padmanabha was the ruler of the state, was considered as the ruler of the state. He is the head of the state. And the king, I mean, the human king, was only his deputy. He was ruling the country on behalf of the Lord. So that was the concept. And then who is the head of the state now? Lord Padmanabha. And so in the past, so these were the stately honors provided to the head of the state. So that was why the police band set and the police gun salute is there. You got it? Still, that is practiced. And no other temple in Kerala, there would be such a state, there would be such state honors. And again, another curious thing was that, interesting thing was that the ceremonial festival procession of Lord Padmanabha, the traditional path was actually now through the international airport of Travancore, of Trivandrum International Airport. But so the thing was that still on the day of the procession, all the flights would be rescheduled and the flights were not allowed to land in the international airport on that particular day. And it was the only occasion on which the public of the state can freely walk through the runway of the airport. You got it? So that means this was once the dominant culture of the state, but now it exists as a relic, as a residue. And this is actually what is called a residual culture, a culture which was the dominant culture in the past, but still exists as residues. I hope it's clear.
Yes, sir.
And now the third form of culture is what is called emergent culture. So what is emergent culture? You know, every society there can be emergent cultures. Emergent cultures means a culture that is actually antithetical to the dominant culture or residual culture. And the freaks in our country is an example of the emergent culture. The freaks, they dress their hair in a particular way, and then the hairdressing is a particular way, and they actually decorate their body with several things, tattoos, then metal rings, then different kinds of apparels, clothes, even ripped and torn jeans. You got it? And the old people of the country might mistake them to be beggars or something like that. And their hair cut just like the toilet brush or something like that. And those people were part of the emergent culture because the idea was that they were actually trying to say that they were not ready to conform to the standards of the dominant culture. And this is what is called the emergent culture. So the subcultures, the hippie, punk cultures are all part of emergent cultures. Okay, so these are the three forms of culture introduced by Raymond Williams. So before that, can I take 10 more minutes?
Sure, sir.
Okay. And then there is a difference between culturalism and structuralism. Culturalism stresses the ordinariness of culture, as we have seen now. And structuralism considers culture as a signifying process. So that is the difference between culturalism and structuralism. And till now, we have been discussing culturalism. And then the structuralist turn in culture studies can be seen with the coming of another great theorist, Stuart Hall, the Jamaican theorist, and he became the director of the Center for Contemporary Culture Studies, CCCS, after Richard Hogarth. And Stuart Hall introduced two important concepts of culture called encoding and decoding. So what is encoding? Encoding, he introduced these two terms in the analysis of televisual messages. Televisual messages means like advertisements, television advertisements, films, or something like that. So there are these two important concepts: encoding and decoding. So what is encoding? Encoding refers to the process of encoding a meaning, encoding a televisual message with a meaning, and that is what is called encoding. that is encoding the televisual message, televisual event with a particular message or meaning. And this is what is called the encoding. This is usually done by the maker of the televisual sign. And decoding is the way in which people decode things, how people decode, ideas, or how people receive and make sense of the televisual messages. And this is what is called a decoding. So these are the two important processes, encoding and decoding. And again, according to Stuart Hall, encoding is the process of giving a particular message or a meaning through the televisual message. But decoding, according to him, is done using three different codes. So these are the three different codes: the dominant hegemonic code, the negotiated code, and the oppositional code. The dominant hegemonic code means if the viewer applies the dominant hegemonic code, he will accept the message of the televisual event as intended by the producer, the encoder. And that is the dominant hegemonic code. So that means the receiver or the viewer gets the same meaning as intended by the producer of the maker of the televisual sign. In the second case, the person negotiates with the televisual message for a possible meaning. And in this case, the meaning is not already given. He is actually rather negotiating with the message for a possible meaning. And the third is oppositional code. That means when the viewer uses the oppositional code, he becomes fully aware of the politics or the agenda of that particular televisual message. And in the same way, he rejects what is actually given in the television message. So these are the three different codes: the dominant hegemonic code, the negotiated code, and the oppositional code. Three different codes used by the viewer. So I shall make this clear with an example. Okay. See this. This is also a video, a television advertisement. It is in Malayalam, but don't worry, you will definitely understand the meaning. This is an advertisement of a jewelry. Okay. Have you understood the message? So what is the occasion? So a girl is trying to elope with her boyfriend, and she wrote a letter to her parents, and then she stealthily departed her house. But on the way to her lover, she remembered her good old days, her childhood days that she spent with her parents. And then she returned to her parents. And the parents were really sad, and she got reunited with the parents. And the advertisement ends with the caption, "Trust, that is everything." Trust, that is everything. You got it? And now, if we apply the first code, that is the dominant hegemonic code, we can say that what she did is completely right, because daughters should obey their father. Got it? And there is nothing wrong with what she had done. And so, as a daughter, she should respect her father and she should obey her father. And what he did is absolutely right. This is the dominant hegemonic code. But if we apply the second code, that the negotiated code, we can get another meaning. That means we can again negotiate with the television message. So of course, on one side she kept her promise with her father. She kept her trust with her father. But what about the boy? He was standing there waiting for her at the bus stop. You got it? And that means she betrayed her trust with the boy. And is it correct? And then is it right? If we negotiate with the television message for such a possible meaning, we are using the negotiated code. You got it? We are negotiating with the television message for a possible meaning. But if we use the third code, that is the oppositional code, we can completely reject this advertisement as rubbish. Why? This is the advertisement of a jewelry. And jewelers will never promote elopements and love marriages. You got it? Jewelers will never promote elopements and love marriages. They will always promote arranged marriages. You got it? That is the politics, the agenda behind this advertisement. So thus, by using three different codes, we can make three different meanings of the television message. So this is what he tried to say. I mean, Stuart Hall tried to say. And finally, I shall stop with this point. And still later, another cultural theorist, Paul Duguay, introduced another concept called the circuit of culture. The circuit of culture, according to Paul Duguay, consists of 5 important elements. So which are the 5 elements that constitute the circuit of culture? They are representation, identity, production, consumption, and regulation. So these are the 5 elements that constitute the circuit of culture: representation, identity, production, consumption, and regulation. In the contemporary global market, every product is put within this circuit of culture or marketed using this circuit of culture. First, they actually represent a particular product in a particular way. And the way in which that product is represented is based on the identity of the consumers who are going to use that product. First, a product is, marketed or introduced in a particular way. And once that is done, we can say that that particular product is, meant for a particular group of people in the society. And then production is done on the basis of that. And consumption will also be done in the same way. And all these are mutually interrelated. And there are regulations. Regulation means the rules with which the product is produced and marketed and circulated. So these 5 forms, what is called the circuit of culture, they are representation, identity, production, consumption, and regulation. So here, to illustrate this, Paul Duguay has used, an early advertisement of Sony Walkman. Sony Walkman. And I shall play that advertisement now. The Sony Walkman. Sony. Okay, so here, what is the cultural significance of the Sony Walkman? And that name is very significant. Walkman. That name is significant. How or why? Because, before the introduction of the Walkman, people had to be physically present at a particular place where a musical performance is going on to enjoy music. They had to be physically present there, and they had to sit there. Or otherwise, sometimes if it is a stereo, a musical player, a stereo or a radio, people should sit in front of such an electronic device to listen to the music. That means their mobility was restricted at that time. But after the introduction of Sony Walkman, they could actually enjoy music while walking, while running. And that means the Walkman ensured greater mobility to the people. And that is why it is called a Walkman. Walkman. So that is why that term is used. Walkman. So that means this device ensures greater mobility to the people. And so that means this product is represented as something that gives mobility. This is how that is represented. And then we can identify the identity of the people who are using that, or who are supposed to use this, product. What is identity? So the younger generation, the youth, they are with the greater mobility. And so that means this is meant for the young, vibrant, active people. And again, see in the advertisement, in the first advertisement, you can see that there are two, characters. A Western girl in modern outfits that actually ensures her mobility, and an Eastern man with restricted movements and also with a cloth that restricts his movement. So that means two opposite ideals are given there. And again, the meaning is that this is meant for the young, vibrant, westernized girl. And if the Eastern man, the old Eastern man, wants to be modern and vibrant and active, he must use the Walkman. So the representation is there that it is a product that ensures mobility, and then identity is actually it is meant for the younger generation, the youths, and then it is produced and consumed in the same way. And again, there are restrictions, I mean, rules that actually regulate the production, consumption, and the use of the device, because you cannot use this device while driving. So that is it. So thus, this is, and again in the second advertisement also we can see two young girls dancing, and an old woman was actually walking there with difficulty. And then when she used this electronic gadget, she too started dancing, because it ensures again greater mobility. So this is what Paul Duguay called, the circuit of culture. Okay, this is a very vast topic, and I have touched only, some basics of culture studies with our limited time. So let us stop here now. And I once again thank all the organizers of this, event, all the students, all now my students, and all of them. And so I wish you all the best. And thank you all once again for listening to me all this time. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, sir, for giving us an overview on cultural studies. I really appreciate the way that you presented your presentation right now. It became more clear to us. And yeah, it was a really informative session, and I hope it will be useful for our preparing aspirants. And I also wish a very best of luck to the preparing aspirants of UGC NET exam. I will just like to summarize what sir taught us right now to us. He just talked about historical background, which comprises of wave theory. And then after, he talked about some industrial society, that is urbanization, unemployment, technology, and so on. Then he has just explained us the concepts of Fordism, given by Henry Ford, and also a video that he presented about assembly line production. That was really very good, sir. And he has talked about culture and anarchy, then the great tradition, which was introduced by F.R. Lewis, and also about Birmingham University, I guess, Birmingham University. Yeah. After that, in last, he talked about the coding, the concept of coding and decoding by Stuart Hall, and also concept of circuit of culture by Paul Duguay. Yeah, so I hope I have just summarized it in a good way. Thank you so much, sir, once again. It was really very informative, and I really appreciate the way you just expressed your views. Yeah, thank you so much once again, sir.
Thank you.
So yeah, so before I wind up this session, I would like to share with everyone about the next session of the workshop, which will be held just after this meeting with another guest, that is Miss Unnati Jain. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, sir, once again.
Okay. Shall I leave now?
Sure, sir. Sure.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Soumya, please start.
Sure, sir. Let your unique awesomeness and positive energy inspire confidence in others. I welcome you all once again to the second meeting of Day 12 on the National Level E-Workshop on UGC NET JRF in English. It's a great opportunity for me to introduce our honorable chief guest and keynote speaker, Ms. Unnati Jain, to start the Day 12 workshop. Ma'am is currently working as a senior research assistant in Malviya National Institute of Technology, Jaipur. Her thesis title includes Power, Performance and Identity in Select English Fiction on Female Cross-Dressing. She did her BA Honours in English Literature from IIS University, Jaipur, Rajasthan in the year 2014 to 17. She is a gold medalist and secured first position in MA in English Literature in the year 2017 to 2019 from St. Xavier's College, Rajasthan. She qualified UGC NET in English Literature in July 2018 and also had qualified NTA UGC NET in English Literature in December 2019. She was awarded the Meritorious Academic Record Certificate for standing first in St. Xavier's College, Jaipur, and was rewarded with the 5th in Order of Merit Certificate in BA Honours, IIS University. She did a lot of paper presentation, and the very first one was in St. Xavier's College, Jaipur, on the topic Identity Under Incertitude, Lives in Samshi's Home Fire in International Conference on 18 to 19 December 2018. After that, she did in SS Jain Subodh PG Autonomous College, Jaipur, on the topic Mapping the Horizons of the Stigmatized Breast, Voices from Mahashweta Devi's Breast Stories to the Free the Nipple Movement in National Conference in September 2019. Then she did another presentation in Mohanlal Sukhodia University, Udaipur, on the topic Longing, Nostalgia and Post-Memory in Endangered Diaspora, a study of Peggy Mohan's Jahajeen in National Conference, December 2019. Then after, that was in Lund University on the topic, a study of diasporic memory, post-memory and trauma in Gayatri Bahadur Schoolie Women and Peggy Mohan's Jahajeen in SASNAT 2020. Rethinking the Politics of Memory in South Asia Conference Virtual, then was in Malviya National University of Technology, Jaipur, on Voices from Margins in Manobi Bandopadhyay's A Gift of Goddess Lakshmi, Education and Empowerment of Transgenders, The Way Forward, in online national conference on sustainable development goals jointly organized by the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences. She did her intern as content writing in See Better Consulting Services, LLP. Talking about her teaching experience, she is an assistant professor of English at SS Jain Subodh PG Autonomous College, Jaipur, a technical communication teacher at Malviya National Institute of Technology, Jaipur, MNIT, a resource person for a short-term course on history of English literature for undergraduate and postgraduate students of St. Xavier's College, Jaipur, and an English teacher at Nigotia Coaching Classes, Jaipur. She was the public relation team head at Jairangam Jaipur Theatre Festival. Her publications include a book chapter titled Voices from Margins in Manobi Bandopadhyay's Gift, A Gift of Goddess Lakshmi, Education and Empowerment of Transgenders, The Way Forward, is published in Multidisciplinary Approach to Sustainable Development Goals, Some Issues and Reflections by Amazon Kindle Direct Publishing House. Her other qualifications include certificate course in counseling and guidance.
Please. Let's
Yeah,
cut it short here. I mean, that's too long of an introduction already. Thank you so much. So because it's already here, I mean, we are running short of time anyway. So could you please provide me the co-host rights so that I can share my screen and begin? Thank you so much for such a humbling introduction.
Sure, ma'am. Sure. You can just continue. You can just talk about the topic of cultural studies. And
Sure.
we are really very grateful for your valuable presence with us.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Can you see my screen?
Yeah, we can see your screen.
Just a minute. Yes, okay. So good evening, everyone who is listening to me right now. As Rajendran sir has set the bar so high already with his teaching. So I am slightly nervous as to how I will go ahead. But let me begin with whatever I have on my PPT. So sir has already told you about the beginnings, the origins, the background, the history of cultural studies. But as my first slide says, understanding cultural studies. So I would begin with this. So in everyday life, we make use of the term culture a lot. And we speak about it very often in the context of how culture is changing and what are the elements that represent our culture. So now let us examine what is exactly the term culture, what it exactly means. So culture comes from a German word going back And the word basically means growing. So culture in social anthropology means knowledge. It is the knowledge about humanity which is learned or acquired, but not in any case inborn. So Edward Tyler has given one of the oldest and classical and the most referred to definition of culture, which is, that culture is that complex whole which includes knowledge, belief, art, morals, law, custom, and other capabilities and habits acquired by man or woman as a member of society. So now, need for cultural studies. So before I come on to this slide, I would just like to explain how cultural studies is still relevant and more relevant, getting more relevant, and why we study from perspective of net and English literature as well. So cultural studies is animated by subjectivity and power, how human subjects are formed and how they experience cultural and social space. It takes its agenda and mode of analysis from a lot of disciplines like economics, politics, media, communication studies, sociology, literature, education, law, science, technology studies, history, anthropology, and many more. And it is kind of, coming together of textual and social history under the sign of commitment of progressive social change. So cultural studies is magnetic. It accretes various tendencies that are, splintering the human sciences. Marxism, feminism, queer theory, post-colonialism. So the cultural now has become, so to say, a master trope. It has become a master trope in the humanities. It's blending and blurring textual analysis of popular culture with social theory, and it focuses on the margins of power rather than reproducing the established lines of force and authority. So in place of focusing on canonical works of art, let's say, for instance, Shakespeare, a government leadership or quantitative social data, cultural studies kind of deviates and devotes time to subcultures, popular media, music, clothing, sports. So by looking at how culture is used and transformed by ordinary and marginal social groups, cultural studies sees people not simply as consumers, but as potential producers of new social values and cultural languages. So it takes away the, the hype of the canon, and it brings to us, and it renders all of us as the producers of social change. So now the need for cultural studies. So it provides tools which enable one to read and interpret one's culture critically. So if one's culture is not represented in the canon, through the lenses of cultural studies, through the various intellectual strands of cultural study, one can easily interpret and kind of present to the world their culture. It subverts the distinction between the high and the low culture. And it allows critical scrutiny of culture without prior prejudice towards one or another sort of cultural text. So what else? It establishes culture within a theory of social production and reproduction, specifying ways that cultural forms serve to further social domination or to enable people to resist, voice, and struggle against domination. It asserts value of popular culture, empowers minorities, and values their culture, stressing on cultural pluralism and egalitarianism. What else does cultural studies do for us? It specifies what ideology is operative in a cultural artifact. For example, if you're looking at any monument, for instance, which is highly renowned, people go, and it's a sign of some kind of era in the history. So what ideology was operated when that cultural artifact was produced, and is that ideology still associated with that cultural artifact? It makes people sensitive towards relations of power and domination as encoded in cultural texts. It shows us how media culture manipulates us, indoctrinates us, thus empowering individuals to resist the dominant meaning. So as Sir has already shown us this advertisement by Kalyan Jewelers. So it's a very good example of as to how media culture is manipulating, and actually they have become slaves to that, to science, to media cultures, and how cultural studies would then give us the voice, the knowledge, and the resources and the foundation to now interpret culture in a different way and resist the dominant meaning. So the interdisciplinary boundary of cultural studies. So as I told you that it overlaps with a lot of disciplines, anthropology, it also overlaps with sociology, human history, and so much more. So what are the boundaries of this discipline? So cultural studies is an interdisciplinary field in which perspectives from different disciplines can be selectively drawn on to examine the relations of culture and power. So in cultural studies, there's this liberty that we can overlap all the other disciplines that would help us develop our case better, develop our research better, in order to understand the panoramic view of any one particular cultural belief, cultural artifact, cultural text, anything. So it is concerned with all those practices, institutions, and systems of classification through which there are, they are inculcated in population, particular values, beliefs, competencies, routines of life, and habitual forms of conduct. The forms of power that cultural studies explores are diverse, and they include so much. They include gender, they include race, they include class, they include colonialism, etc. So cultural studies seeks to explore the connections between these forms of power and to develop ways of thinking about culture and power that can be utilized by agents in the pursuit of change. Any public policy cannot be now made without understanding the different idea and the different prevalent notions about a certain culture, and hence not taking into consideration all these factors. The prime institutional sites for cultural studies are those of higher education, and such as cultural studies is like another academic discipline now. Nevertheless, it tries to forge connections outside of the academia with social and political movements, workers in cultural institutions, and cultural management. So hence, where do we come up? So this is a discipline concerned with power and the distribution of economic and social resources. Consequently, cultural studies has been concerned with, in very layman terms to put it, who owns and controls cultural production? Which ideology sustains the most? The distribution mechanisms for cultural products. The consequences of patterns of ownership and control for contours of cultural landscape. So now cultural studies cannot be studied in isolation ever, as we've already talked about its interdisciplinarity and multidisciplinarity. So how cultural studies and politics are correlated. So cultural studies seeks to make a connection between the matters of power and cultural politics. Because without politics and economy, without the intrusion or the role of politics and economy, no culture can run, no culture can be dominant or residual or emergent, as Sir has already discussed with us. So it is a body of theory generated by thinkers who regard this production of theoretical knowledge as a political practice. Your knowledge is never a neutral or objective phenomenon, but a matter of positionality, that is, of the place from which one speaks, to whom and for what purpose. So in the current scenario that we are living at in this era of web, internet, we all know that how cultural politics is determining our ideology, and how who's speaking from a powerful position impacts our views and how we receive that. So cultural studies has to do with everything which has to do with economy, with politics, and things like that. So culture studies as an institutional location. So the study of culture has taken place in a variety of academic disciplines. I've already talked about it. So cultural studies is a discursive formation and is constituted by a regulated way of speaking about objects and coheres around key concepts, ideas, and concerns. Further, cultural studies had a moment at which it named itself, though that naming marks only a cut or snapshot of an ever-evolving intellectual project. So I think that is the best definition of cultural studies, that it is an ever-evolving intellectual project, that the term itself is the name to it, but it is not limited to it cannot limit the scope and the potential this field or this discipline has. So now language and culture are signifying systems. So now that we are talking about cultural studies from the perspective of net, so language and culture as signifying systems becomes a very important thing. So cultural studies has argued that language is not a neutral medium for the formation of meanings, and knowledge about an independent object world existing outside of language. So there's a world that exists outside of language, and only language can make meaning within that world. Rather, it is constitutive of those very meanings and knowledge. That is, language gives meaning to the material objects and social practices that are brought into view by language and made intelligible to us in terms of that language delimits. These processes of meaning production are signifying practices, and in order to understand culture, we need to explore how meaning is produced symbolically in language as a signifying system. That what is the what do I say, what is the omnipresent role of language in signifying which culture would be prominent, or what practice would be prominent. So now these are the components of cultural studies. So production and political economy. So the political significance of popular culture practices is perhaps best exemplified in subcultures. So subcultures signify a space under culture simultaneously, opposed to, derivative of, and informing official, dominant, governmental, commercial, and bureaucratically organized form of life. So it is a shift. Subculture is a shift away from culture as a tool of domination and towards culture as a tool of empowerment. It's a very different take that cultural studies has given to us, that we have now have gotten the power to examine these subcultures, which have nothing to do with the informing and official and the ruling culture. So this move wants to find out how the socially disadvantaged, or the people at the margins use culture to contest their subservient position. So historical and contemporary studies conducted in 1960s and 70s on slaves, on crowds, on pirates, on bandits, and the working class emphasize day-to-day non-compliance with authority. For example, I would like to give you an example. So in UK, there was this research on teddy boys, mods, bikers, skinheads, punks, and school students, teen girls, and dropouts, magazine readers. So people who specifically deviated from the norms of school and the transition to work by entering subcultures. So such research, what did it do? It examined these structural underpinnings to collective style, investigating how their bricolage subverted the achievement-oriented or the materialistic or the educationally driven values and appearance of the middle class. So the working assumption was that subordinate groups adopt and adapt signs and objects of the dominant culture. For example, we eating by forks and knives. So we were the subservient group in the hands of the colonizers that we adopted to the dominant culture, and then we reorganized them, and then we manufactured new meanings. So consumption was the epicenter of such subcultures, paradoxically though, and it also reversed the members' status as consumers. So production and political economy, as we explained through the mode of subcultures, that political economy of culture means to analyze cultural texts within their system of production and distribution. Then there comes the second thing, which is the textual analysis. So textual analysis, in textual analysis, the products of media culture require multidimensional textual readings to analyze the various forms of discourses, their ideological positions, the narrative strategies, etc., which hide behind the wheel of that advertisement. So it is in two ways that we can do textual analysis. I mean, it's in many ways, but I've mentioned two: content analysis and semiology. So what does content analysis do? It is the analysis of the contents of communication, which can involve classifying contents in such a way as to bring their basic structure in front of us. And what does semiology do? It analyzes how linguistic and non-linguistic cultural signs form a system of meanings. And the last thing here would be audience, reception, and use of media culture. So all texts are subject to multiple readings depending on the perspective and the subject position of the reader. So when the author was dead, the reader was born. So every text that is given to us, it has multiple meanings, and it depends on an individual perspective. Someone reading daffodils maybe in the UK would be different, and someone reading daffodils in in India would be different. So every text has multiple readings, and it depends on the perspective and the subject position of the reader. So these are the key concepts in cultural studies. I've given these terms because usually in the NT exam, they ask you direct questions on these terms. They would develop a question around the term, give you 4 options, and ask you to take the most appropriate one. So I thought it would be important to address all these key concepts that are prevalent in cultural studies. The first one is representation. So let's directly go to representation. So representation, a good deal of cultural studies is centered on question of representation, that is, on how the world is socially constructed and represented to us in meaningful and varied ways. So indeed, the central strand of cultural studies can be understood as a study of these as signifying practices of representation. So this requires us to explore the textual generation of meaning. It also demands investigation of the modes by which meaning is produced in variety of contexts. So I would like to give you an example. For example, SUV cars. So their advertisements, portray driving of, an SUV as an exciting outdoor experience full of thrill. Or for example, beer advertisements these days, which show that, drinking beer is the most, it's the quintessential element of a party, and that how a party cannot be cannot be cannot be just organized without having beer. Or how motorcycles are being represented as the manly means of transportation. So things like that, how ideas, how commodities are being represented to us in popular or media culture. So that is very important element of representation. Second would be materialism. So materialism, again, a very, very important term. Culture studies has, for the most part, been concerned with the modern industrialized economies and media cultures organized along capitalist lines. So here, representations are produced by corporations who are driven by the profit motive. For example, Sir talked about Fordism in the US. So in this context, cultural studies has developed a form of a cultural materialism that is concerned with exploring how and why meanings are inscribed at the moment of production. That is, as well as being centered on signifying practices, cultural studies tries to connect them with political economy. So therefore, in addition to keeping the focus on signifying practices, cultural studies also try to connect these to the political economy. In this manner, cultural studies is a discipline that is concerned with power and the distribution of economic social resources. The next term here would be non-reductionism. Again, it's a very key feature of cultural studies. That, however, you must remember that one of the central tenets of cultural studies is its non-reductionism. That is, that we cannot reduce any culture to any, there's no bottom line for any culture. So culture is seen as having its own specific meanings, rules, and practices which are not reducible or explainable solely in terms of another category or level of social formation. So in particular, cultural studies, it has initiated a battle against economic reductionism, that is the attempt to explain what a cultural text means by reference to its place in production process. That, we cannot explain any culture by reducing it, that culture is non-reductionist in its existence. Sorry, I just So the next is articulation. So cultural studies has deployed the concept of articulation in order to theorize the relationship between the components of social formation. So what does articulation mean? It refers to the idea of the formation of a temporary unity between elements that do not, essentially go together. But articulation suggests that expressing or representing and a putting together of various ideas that are not essentially, given together. So this occurs in a context-specific and contingent ways that cannot be predicted before the fact. So culture is hence articulated with moments of production, but not determined and necessary, and vice versa. So in cultural studies, articulation is basically a method to analyze culture. So it envisions and builds up to a new framework for interpretation. The metaphor. So for example, I'll give you an example. There was this game in the US, the Lego game. So it can be so as the users fed data to that game, how they gave data to that game, the original makers of the game, they continuously evolved the game according to the data provided. So they articulated the data in a way that it now seemed more appropriate and enticing to the users who were playing this game, Lego. It was a very popular game back in the I think early 2000s in the US. So then there's popular culture now, because we have talked about subculture, and I think it's important, again, equally important to talk about popular culture. So subordination is a matter not just of coercion, but also of consent. So cultural studies has commonly understood popular culture, to be the ground on which this consent is won or lost. So, as a way of grasping the interplay of power and consent, two related concepts were repeatedly deployed in cultural studies, and especially the texts that, they were ideology and hegemony. So by ideology, it's commonly meant maps of meaning that while they, purport the universal truths and historically specific understandings that are, obscure, but they are still relevant to, maintain power. So this process of making, maintaining, and reproducing accident meanings and practices is referred, as ideology. So I think that is it about this slide. So we go to the next one. Now power. We cannot talk about cultural studies and not, talk about power. So cultural studies writers generally agree on the centrality of concept of power to the discipline. For most cultural studies writers, power is regarded as a pervading, as pervading at every level of social relationships. So power is not simply the glue that holds the social together, but it is, one more thing that subordinates one set of the people from the another. So I'll just quickly go on to the next slide. So now we will enter into the different part of the PPT, which is the intellectual strands of cultural studies. So what I have done is I have segregated this and I have devoted certain slides to each of the theories to explain them in context of cultural studies and to give you a brief idea as to how these cultural strands were developed from cultural studies. I mean, these intellectual strands were developed from cultural studies and how they in turn developed the entire discipline, the entire existence of cultural studies. So the first would be Marxism and the centrality of class. So Karl Marx, all of us know, Marxism is above all a form of historical materialism. So historical materialism basically stresses on the historical specificity of human affairs and the changeable character of social formations, whose core features are located in the material conditions of existence. So what did Marx argue? So Marx argued that the first priority of human beings is the production of their means, the means of subsistence through labor. So as humans produce food, clothes, and all manner of tools in which they can shape and develop their environment, they also create themselves. So that's labor and the forms of social organization that material production takes are mode of production and are central categories to Marxism. So I've explained this already, now coming back. So now, again, before I explain capitalism, I would like to explain Marxism a little bit more. So, for Marxism, history is not, a smooth or an evolutionary process. Rather, it is marked by significant breaks and discontinuities of modes of production. So, Marx discusses the transformation from an ancient mode of production to a feudal mode of production, and then the capitalistic mode of production. So different forms of material organization and different social relations, categorize each mode of production. So for the, like Marxism asserts that each mode of production is superseded by another internal contradiction, particularly those of class conflict led, to its transformation or replacement. So now capitalism is a centerpiece of Marx's work as an analysis of the dynamics of capitalism. So what is capitalism? This is a mode of production premised on private ownership of the means of production. That is, back in Marx's day, it was factories, mills, workshops, and in more contemporary, vein, it is multinational corporations, MNCs, so to say. So the fundamental class division of Marxism, the fundamental class division of capitalism is between those who own the means of production, the bourgeois, and those who are basically propertyless, the proletariat of, who must do the labor to survive. So the legal framework and the common sense of thinking of capitalist society declares that the worker is a free agent and a sale of labor, it's free and a fair contact, that it has no problems to it. So however, Marx argues that this appearance covers the fundamental exploitation that exists in any workplace, and that capitalism aims to make profit and does so by extracting surplus value from the workers. So, thus commodification is a process associated with capitalism in which objects, qualities, signs are turned into commodities, and the surface appearance of goods sold in the marketplace obscures the origins of these commodities in an exploitative relationship, a process Marx calls as very nicely termed commodity fetishism. So what are the problems with Marxism? So, with capitalism, the problems of capitalism include a falling rate of profit, cycles of boom and bust, an increasing monopoly, and the creation of, these two different sets, the bourgeois and the proletariat. So now, how Marxism and cultural studies is correlated. So cultural studies has resisted the economic determinism inherent in some readings of Marxism and has asserted the specificity of culture. So cultural studies writers have, had long, ambiguous but productive relationship with Marxism. So theoretically, a determinist reading of Marxism robs human beings of agency or the capacity to act. This is so because the outcomes of human action appear to be already predetermined and, some by some metaphysical laws, and that drive history from the outside of human action. So it is a problem on empirical grounds because of the failure of significant numbers in, the revolutions, and basically, the oppressive totalitarian outcomes of those that made claims to such revolutions, in short. So it's an engagement with Marxism that cultural studies has been particularly concerned with the issues of structure and action. So on one hand, Marxism suggests that there are regularities or structures to human existence that lie outside of the given individual, that any individual has no control over. And on the other hand, it has a commitment to change through the human agency. So cultural studies basically, has resisted the economic determinism that is prevalent in Marxism. And cultural studies have also been concerned with the apparent success of capitalism, that is not merely its survival, but its transformation and expansion. So this has been attributed to the winning of consent of capitalism on the level of culture, that how it is now widely accepted, and hence the interest in questions of culture, ideology, hegemony, which are commonly pursued through perspectives, have dubbed culturalism and structuralism together. So we'll come on to the next slide now. So culturalism and structuralism, although Rajendran sir has defined this very, 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 in a very erudite manner, but I'll try my best again to define culturalism and structuralism. So culturalism stresses that the ordinariness of the culture and the active and creative capacity of people to construct meaningful practices. Empirical work, which is emphasized within the culturalist tradition, explores the way, that way, and it's active. So culturalism, particularly for Williams and Thompson, is a form of historical cultural materialism that traces the unfolding and the meaning over time. So culture is ordinary. Culturalism stresses the ordinariness of culture and the active creative capacity. As told already, there is a focus on the lived experience. There's a focus on the lived experience and the adoption of a broadly, anthropological definition of culture, which describes it an everyday process of, and it is not confined to high art. So culturalism, particularly as written, is a form of historical cultural materialism. So there's an explicit partisanship in exploring the class bias of culture that aims to give voice to the subordinate classes and to examine the place of culture in class power. However, this form of left culturalism is also somewhat nationalistic, or at least it's nation centered. So hence it has again many conjectures to it. So what is structuralism basically? So structuralism speaks of signifying practices that generate meaning as an outcome of structures or predictable regularities that lie outside of any given person. So, whereas culturalism takes meaning from its, to be its central category, and casts it as a product of active human agents. By contrast, structuralism speaks of signifying practices that generate meaning as an outcome of structures or predictable regularities that lie outside of any given person. So structuralism, it searches for the contrasting patterns of culture and social life, and and how they lie outside of any given person. So structuralism is basically anti-humanist in its decentering of the human agents from the heart of inquiry. Instead, it favors a form of analysis in which phenomena have meaning only in relation to the phenomena and only within a systematic structure, and which is no particular person in the source. So a structuralist understanding, as confusing as it might seem, a structuralist understanding of culture is concerned with the systems of relations of any underlying structure and the grammar that makes the meaning possible. So structuralism basically searches for the constraining patterns of culture and social life which lie outside of any particular given person. So again, a very important concept, that how culture is like a language. So structuralism extends its reach from words to the language of cultural signs in general. So that's, human relations, material objects, images, they're all analyzed as these structures of signs. So Levi-Strauss has given, tells us that, we find structuralist principles at work when he describes this kinship relationship systems like, a language. That is, family relations are held to be structured by internal organization of binaries. For example, for the example of kinship that he's given. So typical of, Levi-Strauss's structuralism in his approach, he talks about food very, expansively to explain his views on structuralism. So he declares that, in his approach to food, he declares that it is not so much, good to eat as good to think with. That is, food becomes a signifier of symbolic meanings. Cultural conventions tell us what constitutes food and what does not. The circumstances of their eating and the meanings attached to them. So Levi-Strauss tends towards the structuralist trope of, binaries, the raw and the cooked, for example, the edible and the inedible, the nature and the culture. So which, each of which has meaning only in relation to the opposite. Without the opposite, without the binary opposite, the latter or the former wouldn't exist. So for example, cooking transforms nature into culture. And how, some sort of dishes, some sort of cuisines would be very specific to a dominant culture, and how raw food is in a binary opposition to cooked food, things like that. So the edible and the inedible that Levi-Strauss talks about to explain the binaries and as a underlying structure in structuralism, the theory. He says that the edible and the inedible are marked by the question of nutrition and by cultural meanings. An example of this would be the Jewish prohibition against pork and the necessity to prepare food in culturally specific ways. For example, the kosher food that they ate. Here, binary oppositions could be the edible and the inedible mark. How the insiders and the outsiders interact here, and hence the boundaries of a culture and a social order. So I think that is how culture has been correlated and been explained as a language. So in sum, I would just like to sum this up. So culturalism focuses on the meaning production by human actors in the historical context, and structuralism points out to culture as an expression of deep structures of language that lie outside the intentions of actors and constrains them. Structuralism asserts the specificity of culture and its irreducibility to any other phenomenon. In sum, again, culturalism focuses on the interpretation as a way of understanding meaning, and structuralism has asserted the possibility of science, of science, and thus of objective knowledge. And culturalism stresses on history, whereas structuralism stresses on science. So now we come to post-structuralism and postmodernism. So post-structuralism rejects the idea of an underlying stable structure, that finds meaning through binary pairs. We just talked about Levi-Strauss's concept of binary pairs. So post-structuralism rejects this idea of binary pairs of black and white, good or bad. Rather, it says that meaning is unstable, it is always being deferred, and it is always in the process. So the term post-structuralism implies after structuralism, that is post-structuralism, embodying the notions of both critique and absorption. That is, post-structuralism absorbs aspects of structural linguistics while subjecting it to a critique that it is claimed, surpasses its predecessor, that is the theory of structuralism. So again, like its predecessor, post-structuralism is an anti-humanist and it's again decentering, unified the coherent human object as the origin of stable meanings. So Derrida, um, a very very renowned name, and the father of structuralism, accepts Saussure argument that meaning is generated by relation, that relations of difference between signifiers rather than by reference to an independent object world. So, for example, if you look up the meaning of a word in the dictionary, we are referred to other words in an infinite process of referral. So it's a spiral. There is no end to the meaning making process. There is no end. It's one meaning, one word is only deferring us to another meaning and another word. So thus Derrida introduces this term, this notion called that of difference. It's basically a combination of difference and deferral, that we are deferring to meaning and differentiating between two words, two meanings only through the method of difference. So Derrida also proceeds to deconstruct this the stability of the binaries upon which structuralism and other Western philosophy in general relied. Okay, so it is kind of a dismantling of the entire structure that gave meaning to the world, that it basically he totally deconstructs this stable structure, and he argues that the undecidability, that there's this undecidability of meaning, and there's this undecidability of binary oppositions. So in particular, deconstruction involves dismantling, the entire dismantling of the hierarchical non-conceptual oppositions such as speech writing, speech/writing, or reality/appearance, or nature/culture, reason or madness. So basically it excludes and devaluates the inferior part of the binary. So for Derrida, basically, if Derrida were here, he would say that we think only in signs, and that there is no original meaning circulating outside of representation. So it is in this sense that there is nothing outside of text, or nothing but texts, basically, which provide meaning in the material world. So basically, that is, the meanings of texts are constitutive of practices. We understand a certain thing because it has once been, perpetuated by a certain culture. So he dismantles this entire hierarchy, and he dismantles the entire binary structure and tells us that there is no meaning, rather there is only difference, and we being taken to one meaning, from one meaning to the another. So now I have just included, there's this picture that I would want to talk about. It's from a Buddhist shrine. So when you look at this picture, there's this symbol. So I have put some questions here for you all to refer to, that what cultural practices would take place around a Japanese Buddhist shrine, and what is the meaning of the sign of, on the flags? What is the sign? The sign, was rotated and used in different contexts. We all know that it is a swastika symbol, but for a Buddhist, in a Buddhist shrine, what does this represent? And what conclusion can you draw from this about the meanings of signs? That how we are driven from signs, that how, in the layman terms, a sign of maybe, let's say, Nike shoes, a tick, that way, a tick mark, a curved tick mark would represent, a certain elite class in a society, that would, represent elitism, or, someone who is associated or has, a lot of money, is associated with money. So similarly, how these signs, for example, swastika, the sign here was also the sign of used by the Nazi Germany, and swastika in Hindu households is a sign of divinity. Similarly, in Buddhism, in Judaism, this is swastika is a sign of a symbol of divinity, but here it's inverted. So again, these signs should make you question that how we are all so much running after, and how we are all, our minds are controlled and manipulated by signs, and how signs are leading to meaning, but again the meaning is deferred to something else. So I've just put this picture in context to make you understand and question what is the role of signs in everyday life that we experience. So now coming to the next intellectual strand, that is Foucault and the discursive practices. So like Derrida, Foucault argues against structuralist theories of language, which are, which conceive of its autonomous rule-governed system. He also opposes interpretive or hermeneutic methods that seek to disclose that hidden, the meaning of language. So Foucault talks about this very important term throughout his work, that is discourse. So what is discourse according to Foucault? So discourse constructs, defines, and produces the objects of knowledge in an intelligible way. While at the same time it excludes other ways of reasoning as unintelligible. For example, Foucault attempts to identify the historical conditions and determining the rules of formation of regulated ways of speaking about certain objects. For example, some practices would be discursive, and how some formations would be discursive. He explores the circumstances, under which statements are combined and regulated, and how they define a distinct field of knowledge. For example, in the STEM field, there would be different discourse altogether. In the humanities field, there would be different discourse altogether. So, how knowledge and objects require a particular set of concepts and delimiting a specific regime of truth. But what is truth? Every particular discipline has its own truth. Every particular discipline has its own discourse. So for Foucault, discourse regulates not only what can be said under determinate social and cultural conditions, but also who can speak when and where. So consequently, much of Foucault's work is concerned with the historical investigation of power and the production of subjects through the power. Okay, so who was in power when a particular subject was created? So Foucault does not formulate power as a centralized one, as a centralized constraint force. Rather, he says that power is dispersed. It is dispersed through all the levels of social formation, and it is productive of social relation and identities. So, Foucault, just a minute, yes. So Foucault is, concerned with the description and analysis of the surfaces and discourse under their effects, and their effects under determinate material and historical conditions. So Foucault conceives of the subject, as radically historicized. That as a subject is historically radically historicized. That is, persons are wholly and only the product of history. He explores the genealogy of the body as a site of disciplinary practices that bring subjects into being. That such practices are the consequences of specific historical discourses of crime, let's say, of punishment, medicine, science, sexuality, major areas that Foucault has delved into. And thus, after researching on all these areas and all these not so researched narratives and discourses, Foucault analyzes that the statements about madness, which give knowledge about it, the rules that prescribes what is sayable, what is thinkable about madness, subjects who personify madness, and the practices within any institution that that deal with madness. He has worked extensively on madness, and he talks about how and when something became unthinkable, and how and when madness was particularly defined. So he questions all the structure of powers throughout the history. He analyzes, questions, speculates on all the levels of social change and how power intervened with all these in the formation of certain discourses. Now we come to postmodernism. So there is no straightforward equation of post-structuralism with postmodernism. It is just the sharing of the prefix post, but it can lead to unwarranted conflation of the two. However, they do share one common approach, and basically that common approach is the rejection of truth as a fixed internal object. So Derrida's assertion on the instability of meaning and Foucault's awareness of the historically contingent character of truth are now echoed in postmodernism. Lyotard now talks about the postmodern. And what does Lyotard talk about? He talks about the incredulity towards meta narratives. So he outrightly rejects the idea of grand narratives or stories that can give us certain knowledge. He outrightly rejects those ideas and the meaning and the moral path of human development. Rather, he has in mind the teleology of Marxism, the certainty of science, and the morality of Christianity. So postmodern writers like our very own Lyotard share with Foucault the idea that knowledge is not metaphysical, knowledge is not even close to metaphysical or transcendental or universal, but it is specific to particular times and spaces. For postmodernism, knowledge is perspectival in character. That is that there can be no one totalizing definition, one totalizing narrative of knowledge that it is able to grasp the objective character of the world. Rather, we have to acquire multiple viewpoints of truths to kind of, interpret and, to kind of understand this complex, really complex, heterogeneous human existence. And, however, when in talking about postmodernism, so it argues that knowledge is specific to language games, that a certain language gives us certain modes of knowledge, and that knowledge is plural, local, and diverse. Postmodern culture is said to be marked by a sense of fragmentary, ambiguous, and uncertain quality of world, along with high levels of personal and social reflexivity. So cultural texts are said to be, typified by self-consciousness, by bricolage, by intertextuality. For some thinkers, postmodern culture heralds, it basically leads the collapse of the modern distinction between the real and the simulations. So that is how much as I can explain postmodernism, though it's a very lengthy, deep topic to be, a subject to be talked about, but due to the paucity of time, this is how much I can explain on postmodernism. And now we come to the next intellectual strand, but before that, let's just sum up. So post-structuralism and postmodernism are anti-essentialist. And they stress that constitutive roles of an unstable language in the formation of cultural meaning. And they argue that subjectivity is an effect of language or discourse. And that all subjects are fractured. That is, we can take a multiple subject positions offered to us in discourse. So fractured, fragmented, broken. These are all terms constitute, very, very poignant in the narrative of postmodernism. That all the discourses are fractured. That from anywhere we can, go into the text in any cultural text and explore it with our own perspective. That there is no one unified meaning. That there are multiple discourses in any particular culture. So now coming back to the next intellectual strand, which is psychoanalysis and subjectivity. So everyone, when we talk about psychology, we know we are talking about Freud. So Freud has given the Freudian theory of the id, ego, and superego. So ego is a conscious, rational mind, whereas superego is a social conscience, and it is the source of repository of the symbolic workings of the mind, which function with different logic from reason. So for example, it is something, that works on the pleasure principle, that you do what you want to do in the very moment, whereas, superego would guide us. It would tell us that, you remember you studied in the moral science class that you should not be stealing objects from a stranger's house, or you should not be stealing in general, because, but then it would say that I really like this flower pot, so I just take it away. So it works on the pleasure principle, whereas superego is all the repository of, knowledge that you have. So within the Freudian theory, the libido or sexual drive does not have any pregiven fixed aim or object. Rather, through fantasy, any object which includes persons or parts of bodies can be the target of desire. So psychoanalysis, it's very controversial, a body of thought, and there are some supporters like Michel and Kodrov who think, it gives strength. And it lies that, there's a strength that lies in the rejection of the fixed nature of subjects and sexuality. So basically, psychoanalysis concentrates on the construction and the formation of subjectivity. So now basically Freud, talks about the structuring of human subject, which is not something, it is not something we are born with. Rather, it is something we acquire through our relationships with our immediate, carers. So the self, by definition, is fractured. Again, a very postmodern condition. And again, a postmodern condition is a text by Lyotard. It's a work by Lyotard that, everything is fractured, and consequently, we must understand the unified narrative of the self as something we can attain over time. That self is over-evolving. So within Freudian theory, libido, sexual drive do not have, any particular meaning. So consequently, an almost, infinite number of sexual objects and practices are within the domain of human sexuality. So, but however, Freud's work is concerned with the documenting and explaining and the regulation of and repression of, certain sexual desires. And he talks about Oedipus complex at great length, and some theorists have outrightly rejected the concept of Oedipus complex. So hence, psychoanalysis happens to be a very what do I say, a very controversial school of thought. And except for Freud, there's so many other psychoanalysts that have also talked. Lacan is one of them, but because I've just included the limited, as much as I could include in this slide. But Lacan is one very important theorist when we talk about psychoanalysis. He has also done credible amount of work when psychoanalysis is concerned. So now I come to my personal favorite and deeply associated topic, which is the politics of difference. And under this, there are so many different other theories. There's post-colonialism, there is race theory, there is Said's hybridity, but I would only talk about feminism because we have limited time. So basically, the subordination of women is argued to be evident across a range of social institutions and practices. That is, male power and female subordination are structural. So it's a field of theory in politics that contains competing perspectives and prescriptions for action. However, in general terms, we may locate feminism as asserting that sex is fundamental and irreducible axis of social organization, to which till date has subordinated women to men. And thus, feminism is centrally concerned with sex as an organizing principle of social life, where gender relations are thoroughly saturated with power. And I'll just go on to the next slide, and I will just explain here. So liberal feminism stresses on the equality of opportunity for women. This is held to be achievable within the broad structures of existing legal and economic frameworks. In contrast, social feminists point to the interconnections between class and gender, including the fundamental place of gender inequalities in the reproduction of capitalism. So basically, feminism would kind of intersect with a lot of other theories as well. There are a lot of proponents of feminism. It would take a different entire lecture to talk about feminism. But for you all, I've just put some snapshots here as to the key concepts and the the theorists who gave these key concepts. There are many more that I have missed upon, but these are the ones that I want to talk about. And I would just like to stress on this quote here by Judith Butler that there is no original or primary gender, or a primary, but gender is a kind of an imitation for which there is no original. So basically, when Butler talks about performativity, she talks about the performance that is performance is an essential part of any gender that we belong to, and that gender is not a kind of an it has no original, rather it has only imitation. However, I have in the next slide talk about the criticism, and these are okay. I've just a minute. So I've just added one more slide just to talk about the different varied experiences of what were the criticisms to white feminism. So in its treatment of the category of woman as undifferentiated, criticism began since then that women are taken to share something fundamental in common. So in contrast to all men. So this is an assumption continually challenged by Black feminists, that among others, who have argued that the movement has defined women as white and overlooked the differences between Black and white women's experiences. So for example, that how Black women are double subjugated, how they are how they are on the they're marginalized in a double way by their color and by their sex. So things like that, and this stress on differences shared by post-structuralist and post-modernist feminists who argue that sex and gender are social and cultural constructions which cannot be in any case adequately explained in terms of biology or reduced to functions of capitalism. So this is an anti-essentialist stance, so to say, which argues that femininity and masculinity are not essential universal degrees or not essential universal categories, but discursive. They're discursive constructions. That is, that gender is constituted by the way we talk about about it and perform it. So as such, post-structuralist feminism it is concerned with the cultural construction of subjectivity per se, and with a range of possible masculinities and feminities that could exist. So towards a conclusion, I would now go towards a conclusion. So basically, towards the end, I would like to show you this table that by now you would have understood what is cultural studies and what it isn't. So for example, it isn't in any case human biology, but it is postmodern art. Postmodern art can be studied under cultural studies. Critical public health can be studied under cultural studies. But for example, ethnography is part of cultural studies. So this basically is a very it's a kind of a summation of what cultural studies is and what it isn't. I'll be sharing the slide anyway, but you can take a snapshot for your reference if you want to of this particular slide, so as you remember, what is cultural studies and what it isn't, for instance. Next, this is a basic, global cultural studies map. I have provided this. You can again take a screenshot if you want for your reference. So it has all the names now, because in my presentation I did not talk about the major proponents and their works, because I wanted to explain the theories, because anyway you would be able to read about the proponents and their works on the internet, but understanding theory I think is much more important, and something that I found difficult when I was studying for net. That anyway I would get a list of names of the major the major popular texts, but I would not get it was a rarity to understand theory by someone. So for your reference, I have provided this table which talks about all the major theorists and where they were living and where they were working. Although Rajendran sir has he has talked in depth about a lot of proponents, but again this was a table for reference. So now for your reference, for whatever has been taught, with a dear student of mine, Nikita, she has helped me to collect some previous year's questions on cultural studies. So I've taken 4 questions to show you, that, okay, we have studied so much, but what were we studying for? We are studying for this exam. So it's an objective exam. It is not a subjective exam. You don't have to write, you don't have to go writing pages for this exam, but you have to be, very smart in a way that you know which option to, which option to rule out when you are selecting some answers, or how to reach your answers. So these are some questions. So for example, I haven't given the answers. Take a screenshot and find answers on your own, so that your brain works a little more, that you're not given everything in here. So from there, whom does Gayatri Chakrabarti Spivak borrows the term subaltern? Or which of the universities, saw the first institutional incorporation of cultural studies? So these are the questions on cultural studies from the previous year's papers. So as you get an idea what kind of questions are asked. There's one more slide which I have put in. So these are previous year's questions again that, I think Sir has talked about the Center for the Birmingham Center for the Cultural Studies. So this was a direct question. I mean, if you even study the first 2 Wikipedia pages for cultural studies, you get this question correct. It is that easy a question. It is that easy a question. Similarly, there's a second question on journal. So, lately NT-Net has started asking a lot of questions on the journals and research. So there are a lot of questions on research aptitude, not just in paper 1, but research in English study and research methods in English. So they would ask a lot of questions on journals as well. That for example, Science is a journal of that publishes articles based on gender, more specifically in very layman terms on gender. So they just ask a question, that out of the 4 journals, which one is not associated with gender? So Science was the one which was associated. I remember the question that way. Similarly, the second question is that what is the name of the journal published from Bowling Green University? So, things like that. So these are the questions that have been asked in the previous years, which should, just give you a sneak peek as to how you should, strategize your preparation. So now, because I have missed out on a lot of things, because I can't cover everything in one lecture, so I've just given you some very recent developments, not very recent, so to say. They have been now decades old, but someone who wants to pursue research in any of these. So these are the upcoming fields, like men's studies, transgender studies, queer theory. They're not upcoming in a very novel sense. They have came decades ago, but something that is now being asked in net. So film studies, question for film studies, theorists on film studies, media and visual culture studies. So these are the texts are being asked in this our NT-Net exam. So since the time NT has taken over the the exam from UGC, they have started asking questions on a lot of these theories, which are not taught to us in our curriculum. So, for example, animal studies is a very upcoming field, and trauma studies, for example, celebrity culture studies, Renaissance studies, very popular in the term, and someone who wants to pursue research or just read them for leisure and information can go through them. And again, some more disciplines, cyber feminism, because I didn't talk about Donna Haraway and the Cyborg Manifesto. So again, mass culture, Stuart Hall, and people like these, and our Indian theorists, Arjun Appadurai, and people like that. So, you can also study in globalization studies. So now I think, one of the last slides, anecdotes and personal tips, because I wanted to talk about it. So I have this personal opinion that one cannot prepare for any exam. I mean, a lot of people tell you that without studying and going through the previous year's questions. So previous year's questions cannot be ignored. And I've written this in a very informal way because that's how I wanted to communicate it with all the students for watching this, that you cannot attempt this or any exam without going through the previous year's questions, because I did, go through the previous year's questions at least 5 times. So I remembered a lot of questions, and the questions are listed, but again they somehow go back to those questions that they've already asked, and they ask them. Sometimes they ask them directly, sometimes they tweak it a little and they asked it. Again, 4 hours is a lot more than 10 hours. People would tell you that sit for 10 hours and study for net. It is, in any way it's not going to help. If you sit for 4 hours and study with concentration, it is, it's a lot beneficial than studying for 10 hours, and you would retain better if you just study for 4 hours every day. And I think if you are in your masters or you've just done your masters, 4 hours every day could really help you achieve your goal. And then my personal advice, that handwritten notes are greater than anything in the world, that you can't rely on any online source, on any blog, on any of your bulky books, on any of your history books. Routledge is not going to help you till the time you take down notes from Routledge. David Ditches is not going to help you remember British history till the time you just note down some things from David Ditches. So handwritten notes over anything. And I just prefer handwritten notes myself. They help you retain better and you kind of associate with them better. So yes, again, paper 1, you are going to have a session with Manishika ma'am though on paper 1, but I'm going to tell you from my perspective. Some people complain that we didn't get a good percentile in paper 1. So paper 1 is really the game changer for net. You have to devote time to paper 1. You can't ignore paper 1, because anyway who's giving this example literature, he knows his subject really well. He or she knows their subject really well. But paper 1 is something that most of us ignore, which we shouldn't be ignoring. So paper 1 is something that we have to put our focus on. Just read the top, out of the 10 subtopics of paper 1, if you even have 8 covered, I mean, you're very good to go. A score between 27 to 35 is a good score for paper 1 out of 50. And my next point, there's no Bible for English literature. That means that there's no one book that can help you clear the paper. Any guidebook in the market cannot help you clear the paper, because there's a lot of material that you have to go through to clear net in English, but you necessarily don't have to go to books. This time, I mean, we are so privileged to be living in the world of internet. You can directly go to YouTube videos, read on the web. You don't have to buy bulky books, but have to boil down to the fact that there's no one Bible. I mean, there's no Bible for English literature. You can't crack the paper by just reading one single book. If someone asks me, ma'am, please tell me the book, how one book, but there is no one book. There is never one book. So just remember that you have to go through multiple sources, make your handwritten notes, and yeah. A very philosophizing last point, that don't fear failures in case you lag behind by 0.1% or one question got incorrect. Just one question, if it were correct, you would have cleared the exam. So kindly don't fear failures. It's anyway preparing you for a bigger goal. And the more you read, the more the more confident you would be when you go out and research. You'd be knowing more. A lot of theorists, you'd be having good practice of sitting and studying. So net has any competitive exam basically teaches you how to sit on your desk and study for 4-5 hours straight, or maybe by taking breaks. So don't fear failures. It's going to teach you something in the end. So I want to end by this quote from Maxwell, that people work to make culture. So it's not only writers or technicians or artists or carpenters. I mean, and all those who put together movies, books, and such. Culture is also made by labor, not directly involved in cultural industries. So consider, your own daily works of judgment and interpretation about a film plot, your grammar, or a classmate's joke. Think of all those efforts built, the bridges you have crossed, the roads traveled, the means of transport and human relationship, your love story, a brief encounter, and all the hardship, strike, solidarity, death, wage negotiation, debt, and satisfaction embodied in those structures. So, how powerful basically this makes you as an individual, that you are, you are creating your own culture, and that, you are in yourself, you're such an essential part of, the cultural industry, that how each one of us, is such an essential part of the cultural industry. So yes, just a minute. So these are my references. You can take a screenshot. Basically, these are all the books I've referred to. The PDF, 3 PDFs are easily available on the web. So you can just take a screenshot, or this would be there on YouTube. So you can just refer to it if you need some good books on culture studies. Though I will tell you again that these are bulky books, but you can definitely skim through them and find what is important for you. And yes, thank you for listening. That's my email ID in case you want any help from me. So you can refer to this. Soumya, are you here?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So just
thank you, ma'am, for giving us an overview on the topic of cultural studies. We feel delighted and grateful to have had an opportunity to learn from such a talented personality. It was a very fruitful and wonderful session of sharing knowledge with our preparing participants. Thank you so much once again, ma'am. And yeah, before I wind up today's session, I would like to share with everyone about tomorrow's workshop, which will be held sharp at 7 p.m. with another guest, Dr. S. Prithvika. This event will be hosted by Ms. Hivangi Yadav. Until then, take care, everyone, and have a good night. God bless you all. Thank you for joining in. You all may leave now. And thank you so much, ma'am, once again.
Thank you, Soumya. Thank you.